Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here to review a movie called Ghosts of Mars. It's a John Carpenter film. Ultimately, I had seen this late at night at some point, and when going back to it, I didn't realize what exactly every single cast member was in this film until watching it again. I'm like, oh wow, this actor is in this movie? Oh wow, like this person is in this film? Wow, okay. Cause I got like a little bit of sliver of this film. I think I got more towards the end of the film. And reasonably, I had recently watched an anime that was somewhere in the ballpark of this. I had watched, I believe it was like Iron Fortress or something like that. That is an anime about zombies seemingly attacking trains a lot. Because ultimately you have like a very Snowpiercer like way of people desperately needing to be left on a train because zombie apocalypse. So it's so this movie is quasi similar to that. So going into this, I really very much like this movie doesn't exactly like gravitate as a really like story movie. It's just kind of like it's kind of one of those kind of Doom or quasi like Resident Evil kind of things where you kind of have to invest in the character as the story is going along with whatever story it wants to give you. Because I say story because it it's just an action movie for the most point. It doesn't have to deliver much of like it doesn't have to have you like completely familiar with any of the characters. You're familiar with the characters as the story goes along. For those of you who ultimately know films like Species, you'll probably know the main focal pointed actress in this movie. She was also in Deception as well, the Ewan McGregor, Hugh Jackman movie. Ice Cube is in this film. And I was like, yeah, hey, cool, great. I didn't remember he was in this movie, sadly enough. Jason Statham is in this film. Early Jason Statham, when he had hair, and dare say he puts on a fairly odd performance in this film because, like, when I saw him in this film, like he acts way differently than I've ever kind of seen him in any other film. Like he plays the guy that wants to like sleep with the main actress. He's just like, yeah, how about we get together and just bump uglies, like he's like consistently like after her, and he's like picking out rooms for them to just have it out, because he's like, dude, the world's ending around us. It's like, how about we give it a go? And she's like, you serious right now? It's like, um, yeah. And eventually, there's a lot of like side characters that I remember, or that I kind of like remember from other things. I'm like, oh man, he's in this film. She's in this film. I was so excited about the cast just because of the little actors. Like the guy who ultimately played the main character from The Revenge of the Nerds is in this movie as like a side character, which pops in here and there. Um, yeah, the girl from The Faculty that ultimately played the kind of girl that ends up with the jock kid, where the jock ends up like quitting football to just like eventually just or go into academics. I think same person. I think I could be wrong. Uh, yeah, you get to quasi know freaking any number of different actors and this and that. So Ghost of Mars really breaks down as a bizarrish, bizarrish, Resident Evil quasi, uh, like it kind of breaks down as like you have these people that end up going and doing this like mining thing, and then all of a sudden this weird, bizarrish red like mist and or fog comes and attacks them and turns them into these voodoo-ish looking characters that ultimately are very disturbing. They just start bizarrely like really manufacturing themselves and like just attaching things to their bodies, which doesn't quite make sense. It seems like they're piercing their bodies with a number of different things. They are disfiguring their own bodies because they don't know any better. And ultimately, they are eventually just whoever is not one of them, they go and attack at some point. This very much kind of reminds me if the movie The Thing at some point was, instead of it being like alien monsterish things, like if it was like zombies instead, or the equivalent of ghost slash zombies, basically ghosts that possess people and then take control over them. So recently it kind of reminds me of like The Thing a little bit, because there's such a big wide like amount of deserted area. There's a there's like a big amount of distance seemingly within the setting. It's not like all like compiled and like you're everywhere you go you're seeing a crap ton of details and this and that. Also, this movie breaks down to be like a very futuristic story. Like, we are, of course, left on Mars because ultimately, I'm assuming, yeah, Earth didn't quite work out, so we're just kind of destitute to be on Mars. And ultimately, people can breathe on Mars as well. People can breathe on Mars. It's weird. So, anyways, going into this going into this film, there's not a lot that I could break down it cryptically, because ultimately it's not a movie that has a lot of like story. It doesn't have a lot of, it's just like, okay, now that we've got to our setting, with there being some kind of like side narration like that repetitiously keeps appearing, because somebody has to like tell you the story of things while it's going on, because there's two sets of like things simultaneously going on throughout this movie. We have somebody like narrating what's going on, those scenes pop up, and then we have scenes of what is actually going on, and this and that. So reasonably, this place was just trying to reasonably this future police esh like force was just trying to find somebody to arrest, and they ended up uh, being arrested in some form of another themselves, arrested to this place to eventually figure out how to get out. So a pretty decent film. It is kind of slow going. It does have a very slow momentum to it, but I don't know, like compared to a lot of movies quasi like this, like Dusk Before Dawn, or any number of other just kind of like I mentioned before, like Dooms, or stuff like that, where it's just kind of like you kind of slowly get into this, and then you get what you get out of it. So, kind of an interesting film, but at the end of the day, it's not something that I would say everybody needs to go see, but ultimately you could see some actors that are just kind of like on the early stages, especially Jason Statham. It's kind of weird to kind of see him do this kind of role and be this kind of person and this and that. So, Ghosts of Mars, by and large, you can ultimately see this movie on the app called Crackle. You can see it on Crackle, and or ultimately you can just kind of just go and end up just going to any movie app that there in fact you can see any number of films and just bootleg it through that, I guess, if that's what you want to do. But Crackle is the current way that you could say that you've seen this movie. And yeah, so let's get into spoilers about this movie, because ultimately, yeah, it's very tough to talk about this in a cryptic like sense. So let's get on to spoilers. So ultimately, yeah, just kind of an overall just enjoyable film. I think from what I got out of it, I was just kind of like, the first time that I probably watched like a piece of this, I was just kind of like, this movie is so odd. But then watching it back, I was like, you know what? Like, this actual movie was probably better, like, overall than, like, I initially thought it was going to be. Like, I thought it was, like, a blatant ripoff of any number of just, like, I thought it was a zombie film. So I'm like, a zombie film in space. This makes no sense. But then when I got into it and I saw the full story, I'm like, oh, so it's not just a zombie film in space. There's something more there. So dare say, let's get into Ghosts of Mars. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. Again, this is probably like a high tier top branch of film. But you know what? It's a John Carpenter film that maybe a lot of people do not know exists. So they might be interested just with the slapping of the name of John Carter or John Carpenter, if I've even said that incorrectly or correctly at certain times. It'll say so on the thumbnail, so I don't need to go through and mention to you who is all in this film. So, spoilers. So we ultimately have a character in the beginning of this movie that is on this futuristic like futuristic like train on autopilot, and she's ultimately cuffed to some bed. She arrives at her destination, the train stops, and she ultimately has people coming into the train and uncuffing her and bringing her into her facility because she is a police officer. Ultimately, she goes to her head officer people that are all just kind of sitting on this round table like thing, or this kind of conference like table thing, and they're asking her, it's like, hey, where is your convict, and where is also the rest of your team, and hey, like, what happened to you? And so ultimately this blonde-haired girl has to ultimately explain exactly what had happened to not only her, but her staff and everything else. Ultimately breaking down a story that no one would possibly ever believe, but indeed she's just telling this story. So, we have this police force staff in this story sequence, all heading to this location on this futuristic like train. And so they all get out of the train eventually and head around to this seemingly deserted town. This town is severely quiet and nothing makes quite much sense. So they ultimately just go like, well, I guess we should just go to like the whatever their like police station is. They head into there and they realize that there is quite a few people in the jail cell. And it's like, okay. We have one person that evidently does not deserve to be there, but she wants to be there because supposedly it's the safest place. Ultimately, they have the police officers asking this woman, like, why are you in this jail cell? And she explains that ultimately she had her, like, air balloon, her air balloon taken out by some windmill thing, and she was dropped here, and she noticed that there was some very unsavory looking characters. Eventually, we find out later that this girl was, like, I think incorporated in them mining at Mars, and supposedly, yeah, like I said in the thing before this, I had mentioned that all of a sudden there was this like red mist that appeared on all these people and possessed them into being these voodoo-esque looking deformed like people that would be bizarrely putting like metal pieces into their bodies, um, piercing themselves with metal parts and this and that, and looking very voodoo-esque like and very weird looking. So these people hide out in there to protect themselves from whoever these possessed people were. They aren't exactly zombies, but they kind of seem that way. But it's like you didn't want to do just zombies, so you wanted to do like possessed ghosts that possess a person and take them over, but they're like zombies. You really had to overly complicate it, didn't you, Mr. Carpenter? You couldn't give us a simple zombie thing going on here. Oh no, heaven forbid you do that. So we we have one of the prisoners who, of course, is Ice Cube, and ultimately they want to like ask him information because that's who they are here for, to collect. They're asking him information. He won't give anything up. So eventually, these people start surveying the land because like they can't believe these people's stories, and ultimately they just want to find out things for themselves. Kind of scavenge for resources and stuff like that, so that way they can kind of make sure like what they were told was something justified, and this and that. So eventually people start kind of just wandering around. They kind of like certain people go like individually, and some people like go as like ones or twos or whatever. So searching around, and eventually they bump into these quasi like zombified ish like people. I think the blonde haired girl and Jason Statham go together at one point, and see this guy in this car who is ultimately telling them like not to open the door and to not uh, like he's telling her a bunch of stuff. And so while this guy is telling her that, he is just scraping his face, and he is of course the one that had gotten turned. Fortunately, they kill this person, and because he's crazy, and then like certain like zombie-ish like characters start possessed ghost characters. I don't want to say zombie characters, but possessed ghost characters come in and start attacking these people, and they just start killing them. Eventually, Jason Statham eventually goes to the mines to find just a slew of possessed people that are all scattered together and are going to eventually seem to be on some warpath with whoever is left alive. Eventually, Jason Statham bumps into some very crooked like characters that are all very much out for themselves. Ultimately, we find out one of these three guys. Ultimately, one of them is the brother of Ice Cube's character. So we have these three guys that seem to be like very like crooked and are only like protecting themselves. They eventually take advantage of Jason Statham, and they ultimately force him to take them to Ice Cube. So they all go to this prison, and they all conveniently gangle back up, or all the people get all up together, and seemingly at one point, some possessed ghost creature gets into the prison. They end up killing that thing, and it ends up possessing one of the people in the prison. Because again, once you kill one of these things, the ghost just goes somewhere else. So there's a person in the prison who again is like scraping his face with his own fingers because he doesn't know any better. So ultimately, we figure out that the very much bigger guy and Ice Cube are brothers, and they're coming up with a consensus of what their game plan is going to be to get out of here, because that's all that really matters to them. They otherwise decide to eventually seemingly plant explosives to kill this thing because they want to get rid of it. So, and eventually the big scramble is for them all to make it back to this train. Uh, Ultimately, sadly enough, the train is not still there when they are supposed to like get to it, so they have to call the train back for them to like come and get them, and of course, yeah, they do. So all the while this is going on, we as we're waiting for the train, like we are slowly but surely just like all of a sudden like all the zombies are starting to like get to these people that are going after this train. Everything is popping off. Like as the people are trying to get into the police, like back in the police station, like it's bizarre how these possessed ghosts use weaponry. Like you have these like bizarre like flinging of these like metal blade discs that like chop off people's arms and chop off people's heads. It's kind of hilarious when seeing it, because like yeah, you're just seeing these like metal like disc blade things that are getting freaking like chopping people's arms off and everything like that. It looks like it's a very hobo-ish way of these possessed creatures like killing these people with these like very hobo-ish like tools. Like there's like spears that are made out of like metal that attack some of these people and this and that. It's very hobo-esque, their weaponry, and because again these are all like voodoo-esque looking creatures. I'm kind of a little confused. I'm like, shouldn't they all look like mine characters, and then mine characters that eventually have like shovels and stuff like that? Like, cause it looked to be like they're miners to me. So we ultimately have them all like scrambling for this train, because ultimately they are like shotgunning their way and shooting their way through some of these possessed ghost monsterish things. they're all running to the train, and like while this is going on, we're seeing like metal blades or metal spheric not exactly like ninja stars, but you know, like the ones you would use for like certain kind of saws, like circular, or like the blades that I don't know how to explain it. Um, you would probably have to watch the movie to see it, but ultimately, if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Like very much like big fat ninja star esh like things, and kind of something like that. Kind of like the you can probably understand what I'm saying when you see the movie or see some of the attack weapons that they use, or if you watch any of the kills that are in any YouTube video, you can understand what I'm talking about. So they're throwing these things, and ultimately, like one by one, you are starting to slowly but surely, as everybody's running for this train, you're eventually seeing the hero numbers like dwindle slowly but surely. You're starting to see Ice Cube's brother's character get killed, and he's starting to slowly become like a monsterish thing. You're starting to see uh, one of the girls that is like always like kind of in the background, but she is one of the police officers. She ends up getting brutally killed by having her like head getting chopped off. You're starting to see Jason Statham um, like starting to like hand to hand combat, like start to take people down. But then he, of course, gets overwhelmed and killed. Jason Statham gets killed in this movie, and I'm like, what? Like, what? Jason Statham gets killed in this movie? How could that have happened? Well, I guess he didn't have like a big name then, so I guess he didn't have to survive to the end. And the guy from Avenge of the Nerds, his he gets a blade to the neck, and he goes down out of the train. You get so many different people that I've seen from like random shows, movies here and there. Eventually, they get killed. People from the train who ultimately came out to help them ended up getting killed, and so it basically just ends up to where ultimately it's just Ice Cube and the blonde haired girl that's of course the one that has to be alive because she has to be the one telling you this story. So she has to be alive. It would be weird if she died there. Uh, Bizarrely though, she ends up getting a ghost possessed within her in this story, but bizarrely, like she was just thrown outside. She was thrown outside, and ultimately, bizarrely for her, the ghost decided to not possess her and take her over. And so ultimately, she went back into the prison and say, "Hey guys, I'm fine. Like, look at me. I'm talking normally. Hey, look at me." And then Ice Cube and Jason Statham are looking at the camera and they're like, "Yeah, she must be fine because ultimately, like, if she was a monster, she wouldn't be able to talk." So they have her come back in. Um, but that happens in a bizarrish portion of this movie. So again, everybody pretty much dies with the exclusion of the blonde haired girl and Ice Cube. They make it onto the train, but while they're getting the train going, ultimately there's a couple of stragglers, possessed monster zombie ash like creatures that are climbing onto the train, and so ultimately, like Ice Cube has to get rid of them. So he splits he splits the train, but before he does that, he leaves some explosives on the other section of the train, and then kind of lightens the train up because ultimately everybody's dead anyway, so it's not like everybody's going to be sleeping on this train. So like both of them are just kind of happy to be alive, and so the cop is mentioning that she's still gonna have to take him in, but hey, at least you're alive and you're not a possessed ghost or whatever. So she like talks to Ice Cube and she's well, it's it's too bad that your like brother ended up getting taken, and he was just well, hey, I stopped caring about a lot of things for I don't know how long now, so it's not a big deal. So, but eventually they kind of have this heart to heart moment, and Ice Cube takes her hand, and eventually just takes her hand and cuffs her onto the bed to where she can't get away. And she's like, "What are you doing? I'm gonna have to take you in." And he's like, "Yeah, you know what? I don't think so." So he eventually just escapes the train, ultimately for her to land at the police station and tell, and we're able to tell all these people this whole story. So ultimately she tells them this whole story, and they obviously do not believe her. They're like, yeah, who's gonna believe ghosts possessing people on Mars? So the blonde-haired girl ends up just kind of going back to her barracks or her room or whatever. She gets dressed. Ultimately met by Ice Cube. Ice Cube has these big silverish guns, and they are just firing away. And I'm just wow, okay. So this is kind of leading up to their, I guess, being, if this movie was good enough, there'd be a sequel? I don't know, but it was just kind of a weird it was kind of a movie that was very I wish there would have been more about it. I wish we could have known more about the characters, and I wish that we could have it doesn't quite there is kind of a it's kind of a weird story to go into. There's a lot of weird elements going on to this movie, but yeah, it's just one of those obscure movies that eventually somebody at some point randomly will see at some point and just be like, yeah, I saw this. And just be and it's a John Carpenter movie, and it's just kind of an unexpected John Carpenter movie. And yeah, so yeah, that's all I wanted to say about this film. And I only took 33 minutes to do it. Yeah. Because ultimately it's Ghosts from Mars. Who ultimately really cares about this movie? Maybe it has a cult following at the end of the day, because you see a lot of movies like this, kind of like Resident Evils or something like that. So it's Resident Evil, but on Mars. Or it's kind of like Doom quasi, but on Mars. So by and large, a very odd, strange movie I saw at one point, or I saw technically twice at some point, but I didn't get the meat and potatoes of the story previously, but now finally meat and potatoes. So I'm gonna get out of here because ultimately I have other things to do today. So I'm gonna go out of my way to say I'm gonna go out of my way to say goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.